Okay, let's get into this. When we try to trace the origin story of the United States, it's it's rarely a simple narrative.
Not at all.
It's not just a story of a few English ships landing on the coast. It is this incredibly dense layering of, well, sophisticated ancient cultures, catastrophic change, and deep political contradiction.
A lot to unpack.
A lot. So today, we are taking a deep dive into that foundational colonial period. We've pulled together a stack of sources, and our mission is simple: to give you a fast, thorough, and structured understanding of the steps that really molded the landscape of the original 13 colonies.
And we have to begin at the true starting line, right? Which is long before 1607.
Long before.
If you look at the human timeline on this continent, the initial migration from Asia, it happened roughly 40,000 to 12,000 years ago.
And these weren't just, scattered tribes. Our material really drives home the sophistication of some of these pre-Columbian societies.
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about the Mississippi culture, which flourished long before any Europeans arrived, we're discussing state-level societies.
With complex economies, architecture.
Precisely. Think about Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. That was a massive, organized urban center. It had this elaborate mound architecture and an agricultural base that supported tens of thousands of people. These were advanced civilizations.
Which makes the catastrophe that followed European contact just even more significant.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a clash of arms, it was, in effect, biological warfare.
Unintentional maybe, but that was the effect. The sources are clear that the immediate massive die-off of native populations was the defining demographic event of the time.
Millions of lives lost.
Millions. European-introduced diseases, smallpox being the most virulent, they ravaged populations that had absolutely zero acquired immunity.
So the European settlers, they weren't arriving on a blank slate at all.
Not even close.
They were arriving on a tragic landscape that had been, in a sense, cleared by disease. This massive population loss, in many ways, made large-scale settlement possible.
It's a crucial context for everything that follows. So now, let's pivot to the Europeans. Before the English really cemented their power, the starting line was truly multinational.
Right. And the Spanish were obviously the earliest major players. They landed in La Florida way back in 1513.
And they weren't just confined to the southeast, they pushed far westward, establishing settlements in places that would become key parts of the U.S., like California and New Mexico.
St. Augustine, Florida, founded in 1565. That's decades before Jamestown.
Decades. The Spanish legacy provided this deep root system in the southern and western territories.
Okay, so while the Spanish are in the south and west, the French are carving out this massive interior claim, basically following the big rivers.
Exactly. They set up along the Mississippi, stretching from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Their interest was heavily based on the fur trade.
And on alliances with native tribes, right?
Powerful relationships, often strategic military alliances. Their claim was geographically immense, even if the population was a bit sparse compared to the English coast.
But the influence that I think really surprises people, especially when we're talking about the 13 colonies, has to be the Dutch.
It's a huge factor. The area that became New York was occupied by the Dutch starting in 1614. They called it New Nederland.
And New Amsterdam, its capital, was a critical port from day one.
A hub of commerce, yes. And this is where the source material has a great insight. The English officially take over in 1674, but it wasn't an instantaneous cultural wipeout.
Not at all.
The Dutch influence was so deep-seated, especially in the financial structures and, land ownership, that it survived for generations. If you look at northern New York City and up through the Hudson Valley, that culture it retained a strong Dutch flavor.
So the first big takeaway for you, the listener, is that this project was pluralistic from the very start. It's a complex tapestry of Spanish, French, and Dutch influence, all layered on top of these ancient Native American civilizations.
That foundation is crucial, but of course the political core of the revolution, that came from the English colonies.
So let's detail that. You have this dual English foundation. On one hand, you have the corporate, profit-driven motive, that's Virginia, 1607.
Jamestown was essentially a business venture, a very brutal one.
And on the other hand, you have the religious reformist motive. The Plymouth colony, founded in 1620, was established by people who saw themselves as separating from the Church of England.
And it's important to note they were seeking freedom to practice their specific faith, not necessarily freedom of religion for everyone else.
A key distinction.
Yeah.
And the scale of that religious migration is what really shaped the North. We're talking about a massive Puritan wave, something like 100,000 people migrating to New England.
Which fundamentally shaped the political, moral, and educational identity of the North for centuries.
And the final 13 colonies, that formation was a slow process. Carolina splits into North and South in 1729, and then Georgia comes along in 1732.
And their political status is fascinating. They had a lot of local self-government, they elected their own assemblies, passed local laws, but they were still obligated to serve and obey England.
This constant state of semi-autonomy.
Yes, and this political contradiction is inseparable from the deep moral one that defined their wealth. We have to talk about slavery.
Immediately. The colonization effort rapidly involved the enslavement of new immigrants from Africa. The sources leave no room for ambiguity here.
By the early 18th century, it was a systematic, generational supply of forced labor.
And here's the brutal, unifying truth the sources really underscore. All 13 colonies legalized the African slave trade.
All of them. This was not just a southern anomaly. It was a continental economic system. The wealth generated in northern ports was just as reliant on that institution.
That system fueled an incredible population boom. The sources point to a high birth rate, a low death rate compared to Europe, and stable immigration.
The colonies were just growing at this exponential pace. And as they grew physically, they also underwent a powerful, internal, spiritual transformation.
The Great Awakening, the Christian revival movement of the 1730s and 40s.
And what's fascinating here is how destabilizing it was politically. Preachers were encouraging people to challenge established religious hierarchies.
They rely on their own conscience, their own direct relationship with God.
Exactly. And once people start questioning the authority of the church establishment, that spirit of dissent translates almost instantly into the political realm.
So the Great Awakening provides a kind of spiritual blueprint for challenging authority in London.
That's a great way to put it. So you have this internal shift happening while this massive external conflict, the French-Indian War, was raging.
British forces defeat the French, seize control of Canada, and boom, France is gone as a colonial rival.
That victory was transformative, but it also came with a massive bill. And here's the crucial political detail. Britain deliberately kept Canada politically separate from the 13 southern colonies.
And why does that matter?
Well, it meant the colonists no longer felt that acute need for British protection from the French. The primary foreign threat was gone.
The British military presence, and more importantly, the cost, remained.
Exactly. It created an immediate friction point. So let's zoom in on the demographics right before that tipping point, say 1770.
Okay.
The 13 colonies had a total population of about 2.6 million colonists, not counting the displaced Native Americans.
2.6 million. And our sources point out that was already about 1/3 of England's entire population. These weren't just outposts anymore.
Not at all. They were a massive demographic and economic weight. And within that 2.6 million, the contradiction we talked about becomes unavoidable.
The numbers on slavery.
Nearly 1/5, 20% of the total population were enslaved Black people. Over 500,000 people who were the engine of colonial wealth, but denied the most basic human rights.
That internal tension, paired with the push westward, just guaranteed conflict. As the colonial population boomed, English expansion intensified.
And the native tribes strongly resisted this. They defended their settlements through sophisticated strategies, including warfare and careful alliances with Europeans.
So the frontier was a zone of constant conflict, which brings us to the ultimate political grievance, the cost of defending that growing empire. It came due.
It did. After the French-Indian War, English settlers were subjected to new British taxes.
And the spark wasn't just the tax itself, but the principle behind it.
No taxation without representation.
That was the core of it. The colonists were furious about being taxed by a British parliament where they had absolutely no voice. It was the fusion point of everything we've talked about.
So when we synthesize all of this, the path to American identity was, well, incredibly layered. It was defined by the legacy of ancient civilizations, decimated by disease.
Followed by this multinational scramble for control.
Right. And the ultimate English dominance resulted in a society defined by these simultaneous conflicting impulses. On one hand, advanced self-governance and spiritual revival.
Fueling this idea of universal freedom.
And on the other hand, a massive population growth built entirely on the institutionalized legalization of human bondage across every single colony.
That duality freedom proclaimed while liberty is systematically denied. That is the foundation.
It's a society with the demographic weight and the political framework to demand independence, but one that was built on the exclusion of one-fifth of its own people.
That contradiction is just baked into the very start of the American experiment. The sources show the incredible momentum the colonies had. So, if the fight for freedom was fueled by denying representation and a spirit of religious independence, what does it mean that the 20% who provided the wealth and labor were entirely excluded from that promised liberty?
That's the question, isn't it?
It's the question the founding generation and every generation since has had to grapple with. As you continue your learning journey, keep that duality in mind alongside those enduring cultural layers from the Spanish and the Dutch.